Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the first of 8 Energy Symposium webinars hosted by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The purpose of these events is to present topic-specific information to the Alaska Energy Authority, the Alaska Energy Security Task Force, as they work to develop a statewide energy plan. Today's presentation is the future natural gas supply for the Alaska Railbelt. We're joined today by Deputy Commissioner John Crowther from the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, Lisa Wilcox from BRG, and Frank Richards from the Alaska Gasline Development Corporation. Each presentation is allotted 1 hour, which includes a Q&A portion. As these presentations are intended to inform the task force, only task force members will be able to unmute to verbally ask questions. All webinar attendees will be able to submit questions to the Q&A box on your webinar screen. However, please note that we will again be prioritizing questions asked from the task force members. Today's meeting is being recorded, and the presentation slide decks will be available on the Alaska Energy Authority website. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Deputy Commissioner Crowther from DNR.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, members of the task force and all the attendees we have online. I see there's a lot of folks tuned in, and we're happy to provide this information and share what the department's been working on. If you guys will indulge me for a second, I'd like to think I'm better at deputy commissioning than I am at Zooming, but I need to share the screen here without turning off my different videos and Zoom calls. So can folks see the shared screen showing a title slide for our forecast presentation?
Yep, we got you.
Excellent. And I'm still on video.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, thanks for the patience and indulgence. So I'll be doing a quick overview and introduction here of the presentation today. And I wanted to introduce my colleagues who are on the line. We have our director of the Division of Oil and Gas, Derek Nottingham, our commercial section manager, Johnny Meza, and a member of our resource evaluation section, John Burdick, who will be doing the presentation today. And this presentation, just to provide a preface for the group here. So provide a quick preface of what the department does and some of the things we'll cover today and some of the things we won't cover today. This presentation is about a technical analysis that the Division of Oil and Gas completed in early 2023 about the production and outlook and technical analysis about production forecasts for the Cook Inlet coming from existing fields and resources. It's not a summary of all the different activities occurring in the inlet. It's not a summary of all the different activities the department does to manage current activity in the inlet or some of the things we're looking at going forward to promote investment, development, and exploration. But I included this preface slide just to share a little bit about some of those things we are doing for context as we talk in detail about the forecast and the technical analysis and results that we found there. So just running very quickly through these, the vast majority of areas under development in the Cook Inlet area are owned by the state, either on the state lands, uplands, or state waters in the Cook Inlet. There are also activities and development on federal lands. There are activities and development on private lands, lands owned by Alaska Native corporations and other individuals and entities. And so all of those contribute to the supply of Cook Inlet gas. The state is managing and is responsible for those state lands. So additionally, in addition to just the active management of leases and units, the annual submission of plans of development for units that are reviewed and approved by the department and analyzed for active meeting the requirements under the units and under the leases. We're looking at other proactive management steps that we can take to support competitive royalty, to support competitive investment, to get over some of the barriers to providing the capital needed for critical activities to continue. We did hold a special lease sale at the end of last year. That was intended to coincide with the federal lease sale that was congressionally directed to occur in the federal waters in the Cook Inlet OCS or Outer Continental Shelf And we have another state lease sale that we're expecting to hold at the end of this year. And notice of that sale is imminent, if not coming out this week. We're also working to facilitate gas storage. Many folks on the call would likely be familiar with SINGSA, the Cook Inlet natural gas storage facility that has been instrumental in managing the supply and demand swings throughout the seasonality that we naturally see in our environment. And we're looking at other storage assets, how those can be brought to bear and support the balance in Cook Inlet. And there's significant other commercial, operational, and regulatory alignment that will need to occur for those. That was a sustained effort to get things in place, and we look forward to supporting those efforts if needed for other storage facilities. There's longstanding data associated with tax credits that were previously exploration and development activity in the inlet were eligible for through the state. That one of the requirements of receiving those credits was that the data become public ultimately, and those periods are starting to elapse. Some of them have elapsed, and we're working very hard to have that data widely available and published through our websites and through our Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys that hosts it. And I would just finally note before we get into the presentation by John and the team that we continue to be an informational and data resource for all interested parties. This is a very important discussion about what's happening today in Cook Inlet, but also where it's headed. And we want to provide as much information we can historically in real time and to help policymakers and ourselves as we make management decisions, what kinds of activity and development are possible, are probable, or considerable as we look forward in this issue. So with that, I'll turn it over to our team. I'll continue to flip slides, but I'll try and keep myself quiet, and I'll let my colleague John Burdick take it away.
Hi, John. This is Johnny. I will speak to this slide here, if that's okay.
Please take it away.
Hi. Hello, everybody. My name is Johnny Meza. I work in the Division of Oil and Gas at the Department of Natural Resources. My colleague John Burdick and I have prepared previously a presentation delivered to the legislature on the 2022 Cook Inlet gas forecast, which summarizes information that on a report that the division published earlier this year. But before describing the methodology and results of the study, we would like to present the information about the geology of the basin, the recent evolution of supply and demand of Cook Inlet gas, the fiscal system in place, especially the Cook Inlet Recovery Act and drilling activity to have one measure of success, and an overview of past studies by the division on Cook Inlet gas. Next slide, please.
Hi, folks. Good morning. My name is John Burdick, Petroleum Reservoir Engineer for Division of Oil and Gas. And I'll start off on just briefly touching on Cook Inlet geology. And there's two main sources of gas that come from the basin itself. One primarily being biogenic gas from coals, and that you can see that in the shallower strata on the lowermost figure. And secondary to that would be oil migrated from source rocks, thus creating associated gas from the Cook Inlet. So those are the two primary sources. And the main middlemost figure on the top is a strat column, and three primary areas or three primary rocks that produce gas are the Sterling, Beluga, and Kyonic formations. Next slide, please. And so to begin, this is just just sort of a summary in terms of known accumulations in the uppermost paragraph that have yet to be fully developed, but have been excluded out of the scope of this particular study and forecast. And those are the three primary ones would be the Cosmopolitan, Kitchen Lights unit, and the North Fork unit. as well as several other known prospects that total out to a range between 300 to 700 billion cubic feet. Furthermore, an evaluation by the USGS for undiscovered gas in Cook Inlet, three main sources being the conventional gas, unconventional gas, and the southern Cook Inlet outer continental shelf, and those total out to roughly 20 trillion cubic feet. Next slide, please.
Hi, this is Johnny. Hi, this is Johnny Meza, and I need to figure out the video here on my camera, but I will speak to this slide here. This slide provides information about the production of Cook Inlet gas in billions of cubic feet per year for the past 2 decades. On the left side, we see the production of Cook Inlet gas organized by producer. We can observe that in the early 2000s, oil and gas majors such as ConocoPhillips, Marathon, Chevron, and so on had a significant presence in the basin. On the other hand, the recent makeup of the basin is represented by independent oil and gas companies such as Hillcorp, Fury, Amarok, Vision Resources, and Chugach Electric, among others. It is worth noting that this information is from state lands only. In other words, this excludes federal and private ownership. On the right side, we have production of Cook Inlet gas for the basin from all lands. It is important to anchor the level of production from this graph in the context of a graph for the demand of Cook Inlet gas that we will see later in the presentation. It is evident from this graph that the production of gas in Cook Inlet at the basin level has been declining. However, it is also worth noting that the decline pace has been reduced. In 2000, the Kenai, Beluga River, MacArthur River, and North Cook Inlet fields accounted for at least 75% of the supply of gas in the basin. While these fields remain important, the contribution to the supply of gas from other relatively recent fields, such as Kitchen Lights in 2015, Cosmopolitan in 2016, and Kenai Loop in 2015, becomes essential to meet the energy needs in the basin. Next slide, please. Here we show production information from the AOGCC for the period January through November of 2022 for the different fields and producers in Cook Inlet. Consistent with the previous slide, the production corresponding to Hillcorp's ownership in the various fields in the basin represents about 85% of the total. The next largest gas producer is the group of companies in the Kitchen Lights field, accounting for 6%. For the case of oil, Hillcorp contributes about 78% of the production in the Cook Inlet, with Cook Inlet Energy and Blue Crest accounting for the remaining 22%. Next slide, please. We now turn our attention to the evolution of demand for Cook Inlet gas. The graph to the right shows the demand for Cook Inlet gas in billion of cubic feet per year, organized by end use, with the electric power, residential, and commercial groups representing about 80% of the total in recent years. Another important component to the demand for Cook Inlet gas is by the oil and gas sector itself, where natural gas is used to power facilities in the oil and gas fields. It is worth noting that these annual values omit another important component of the demand for Cook Inlet gas, which is the marked seasonality in the consumption throughout the year. Another important aspect of this graph has to do with the evolution of the demand for Cook Inlet gas. In the early 2000s, the production of natural gas in the basin was more than enough to meet the local needs mentioned earlier. Therefore, the remainder of such production was dedicated to the liquefaction by the Kenai LNG plant, previously operated by ConocoPhillips, and export of liquefied natural gas to Asian markets and to the production of ammonia and urea at the nutrient fertilizer plant. The last LNG tanker departing from Cook Inlet occurred in 2015. Marathon acquired the plant from ConocoPhillips in 2018 and has followed with plans to transform the facility from an export to an import terminal, with an expected capacity to take 1.8 million BTUs of natural gas per year to meet the energy needs of the Kenai refinery. The company has a permit with FERC until 2025. Acrium closed operations of the fertilizer plant in 2007, reportedly due to the short supply of natural gas in the basin and relatively higher prices. The company has merged with another company to become Nutrien, and it maintains plans to restart the facility once affordable feedstock becomes available. Recently, it has partnered with the Alaska Gasline Development Corporation under the Alaska Hydrogen Hub project to use natural gas feedstock from the Alaska LNG project to produce ammonia. Lastly, a small sliver of the demand for Cook Inlet gas comes from the needs of the interior gas utility. The natural gas from Cook Inlet is liquefied at a small facility in Port Mackenzie and then trucked to Fairbanks for regasification and distribution to the interior gas utilities, approximately 2,000 customers. In terms of scenarios for the future of Cook Inlet demand, the outlook remains uncertain, especially for sources outside of the core segments such as residential, electric power, and commercial uses. For instance, the Donlin Gold project could represent an incremental demand of 12 BCF per year. However, the project is not yet at the final investment decision stage. Next slide, please. Having reviewed the supply and demand for Cook Inlet gas, now we review the fiscal system in place for Cook Inlet. At a high level, the graph shows the various production tax systems alongside the number of wells drilled in Cook Inlet as a measure of activity with respect to development of non-gas resources and exploration of potential new gas resources. Every year, the Department of Natural Resources offers unleased area in the Cook Inlet Basin where the state is owner of the subsurface for oil and gas leasing. Typically, these offerings consist of similar royalty rates and only slight variations in terms of rental payments and bonus bids. With respect to production tax, in early 2006, the tax system changed from a gross revenue basis under ELF, based on predetermined thresholds for production levels to represent economic limitations, to a net profits basis with the petroleum production tax and with the Alaska Clear and Equitable Share System, where taxpayers could now deduct their operating and capital expenditures from gross revenue, which continued under the More Alaska Production Act with SB 21. The importance of the fiscal system with respect to Cook Inlet is highlighted with the establishment of the tax ceilings for Cook Inlet gas since 2006 with PPT and with the Cook Inlet Recovery Act in 2010. While it is true that some exploration credits were already in place, the Cook Inlet Recovery Act targeted drilling activity, the construction of gas storage facilities, and the exploration offshore with the jackup rig. Most of these credits, however, were repealed or expired in 2016 and with the enactment of House Bill 247. Only the discovery royalty, under which the royalty rate gets reduced to 5% for a period of 10 years for a development of a previously undiscovered target, remains in place for Cook Inlet. Therefore, a potential new entrant in this market wanting to explore gas resources in the inlet would find a much different picture than about a decade ago. Although this graph cannot be interpreted as a measure of cause and effect between the existence of credits for oil and gas development and exploration and the number of wells drilled, it is still important to note that at least the number of exploration wells in Cook Inlet have significantly declined, while a cheaper alternative, but not a complete substitute, is being used, namely stratigraphic wells. Next slide, please. This is a slide with information on the price of gas in two different markets, the Cook Inlet Basin and Henry Hub, which is a distribution hub in Louisiana, which is the physical interconnection of interstate and intrastate pipelines. The latter represents a pricing point for traded natural gas spot and future contracts in the New York Mercantile Exchange. This is due to the great variety of supply and availability of infrastructure, which helps in providing liquidity to that market. In contrast, the market for Cook Inlet gas is based on the dynamics of local supply and demand, with relatively few suppliers and a market represented by local utilities. As a result of the shale revolution and the consequent increase in the supply of natural gas, the price in Henry Hub has declined to an average of $3.50 per thousand of cubic feet. Although not shown in this graph, the price of gas at Henry Hub reached $13 per thousand of cubic feet in June of 2008, which was higher than the prevailing value of Cook Inlet gas at that time. Therefore, there were periods in this graph, in this timeline, where the price of Henry Hub was greater than the price of Cook Inlet gas. And the main point with this slide is to show that the pricing is a reflection of the different structures in these two markets, with the Cook Inlet gas being a more isolated one and local one. Next slide, please. As discussed before, exploration drilling activity in the basin has declined over the recent years. The graph on this slide shows the makeup of production at three different points in time: 2005, 2010, and 2021. With the natural decline from the production of oil and gas reservoirs, it is reasonable to expect that the contribution to production of the more recently drilled wells will become significant. In this way, for the production in 2021, we can see that 80% of such production comes from wells drilled after 2000, thus highlighting the importance of continued exploration to stem the natural decline from older wells. Next slide, please. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Johnny. Okay, so I'll give an overview of past Cook Inlet studies that were conducted by the division, and really what propelled this was in the mid to late 2000s there was a perceived concern about the basin going gas short, and so that created an evaluation conducted by the division starting in 2009. Mostly this was an engineering and geological evaluation of remaining Cook Inlet gas reserves. And what this study consisted of was geologic engineering evaluations of, at that time, 28 currently producing Cook Inlet gas fields in order to derive estimates from remaining proved and probable reserves. And what it really employed was applying single deterministic decline curve analysis and material balance engineering applications using publicly available publicly available data sets provided through the AOGCC, or Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. What this study did not address was economics of drilling additional wells, recompletions, infrastructure optimizations, nor the ability to sell gas into the Cook Inlet market. And what this 2009 study concluded was a proved plus probable reserve estimate of approximately 1.1 trillion cubic feet. Fast forward to a few years, 2011, the division opted to do a production cost study, which investigated investment requirements around targeted reserves. And it really it addressed commercial viability of remaining gas by coming up with conceptual plans to produce natural gas that would meet an assumed demand of 90 billion cubic feet per year. Next slide, please. And going towards 2015, this was mostly an engineering evaluation, but incorporated the same principles that were noted in the 2009 study. And at that time, there's 34 currently or historically producing gas fields that really ultimately came out with estimates to conclude of approved plus probable reserves. And really it was a mere application of applying, again, a single deterministic decline curve analysis and material balance engineering methods using publicly available data from AOGCC. However, this particular study did not address perspective, also known as undiscovered, contingent, also known as discovered non-producing, nor 3P, meaning proved plus probable plus possible reserves. And what this 2015 study concluded was a proved plus probable reserve estimated at approximately 1.2 trillion cubic feet. And most recently, advancing to 2018, the division released a Cook Inlet natural gas availability study that merely built on the previous 3 studies that I just mentioned, that incorporated future supplies by formulating hypothetical development projects that would be required to produce undeveloped volumes and estimate each project's economic viability. And what it found, it was a range between 500 to 800 billion cubic feet of additional gas would be economic to develop at a price range in 2016 dollars of approximately 6,000 to 8,000 cubic feet, or I'm sorry, $6 to $8 per 1,000 cubic feet. And really that's a P50 reserve estimate of approximately 700 billion cubic feet when priced at $8 per 1,000 cubic feet. Next slide, please. Now that brings us to this current study, 2022. And I'll just touch on the scope and assumptions. And really what this study was, is it was a technical reserves assessment evaluating 90 different gas and oil pools as defined by AOGCC using, again, publicly available production data obtained from AOGCC. And what this study employed was a decline curve analysis used to estimate volumes from a currently producing well set, as well as employing a type curve analysis in order to develop estimating volumes for future development wells. What this study did not include was discovered resources that were contingent upon favorable commercial conditions, as well as undiscovered or prospective resources, again, that were not included in this forecast. However, the economic limits were factored in order to estimate field level outcomes using what we'll term as a truncated forecast case. The forecast volumes do not account for gas produced from gas storage, simply so as to avoid duplicative gas volumes for sales. One thing is we applied a flat gas demand of and assumed 70 billion cubic feet per year, but it didn't assume future additional requirements, nor did it assume any possible substitutes to increase efficiency in consumption, both for energy producers and commercial or domestic consumers. The main key assumptions for this study, we assumed a development drilling pace of 15 wells per year until 2030, with no new wells beyond that. And it's not a prediction that no additional drilling will occur after that date. However, we deem that drilling pace up to that 2030 timeframe would be assumed to be a reasonable application. Another key assumption, we assumed a gas price would be flat with escalation or for inflation. It does not forecast market changes responding to supply and demand. Another thing that is not included is the contribution from, again, non-producing known prospects or contingent resources for this particular forecast. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a main slide that I alluded to in the previous slide, but we took a look back of pre-pandemic, I mean, for obvious reasons, there's the market volatility that the pandemic caused. So we wanted to get a good snapshot and a good data density of what we felt would be a realistic and reasonable accounting for development drilling pace. And as you see, from 2009 to 2019, we felt that was a good data spread. And what that came out to was approximately 15 development wells drilled per year, accounting for that time frame. Next slide, please. And I'll pass this one on to Johnny.
Hey, Johnny, you may be muted if you're speaking.
Hello, can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I could hear you, Johnny.
Thank you, sorry for that. So as I was trying to say, in this study, we apply an economic limit test to the gas forecast resulting from the decline curve analysis and the type well curve analysis that my colleague John Burdick referred to earlier. This economic limit test is essentially a comparison of marginal revenue to marginal expenditure. The goal is to reflect the principle that once the necessary capital expenditures are already incurred, the producer of an oil and gas field will keep operating the field to the point where it can no longer cover the operating expenditures, at which point it will consider shutting down the field, absent any other investment in the field. Therefore, any gas forecasted via the decline curve analysis and type well curves beyond such point would no longer be available to the market. In the calculation of revenue, we consider the forecasted production. However, we only include the share of such production that is not used for in-field operations and for enhanced oil recovery, since these two do not directly generate revenues. With respect to prices, we consider a profile of gas prices that approximates those observed in the multi-year contracts between some Cook Inlet producers and the local utilities. On the expenditure side, we apply a one-size-fits-all approach with respect to production costs. However, we allow for some variation among fields with respect to the distance to infrastructure. In this way, offshore fields will tend to experience a higher cost than those onshore. Similarly, fields on the western side of the inlet would face a higher cost than those on the eastern side, which tends to have more robust road system. Additionally, we consider royalty, overriding royalty, and taxes in this calculation. We use a royalty rate of 12.5% and various values of the overriding royalty interest where applicable. For production tax, we use the previously mentioned ceilings for gas and oil. And for property tax, we apply the rate of 2% to the taxable value of the oil and gas infrastructure. It is worth noting here that this economic limit test is applied to each oil and gas field independently. In other words, by design of the scope of this project, it does not consider second-order impacts among fields or to the midstream segment. In this way, there is no modeling of the economic viability of the Cook Inlet Basin as a whole. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is a forecast plot. This is the untruncated forecast, meaning there's no economics factored. So this is a technical, theoretically based forecast. It's gas rate versus time, and what the outcome was, we had a high case result in approximately 1.4 trillion cubic feet for our high case, and our low case arrives at approximately 843 billion cubic feet. our mean case, what we consider a main case, arrived at 1.1 trillion cubic feet. A main observation for this particular plot, you can observe the sort of sawtooth pattern for each of those profiles, our respective low case, mid case, high case, and mean case. Really what that sawtooth pattern reflects is our assumed application for 15 development wells drilled per year. Next slide, please. And this slide here is just shows the impacts to economics being factored, known as our truncated forecast case. And what this our high case arrived at was 1.1 trillion cubic feet, as low down to our low case to 603 billion cubic feet, with our mean case arriving at 820 billion cubic feet. And I'll hand it over to Johnny for additional comments.
Thank you, John. What I wanted to share here in this slide is as John referred, the impact of applying the economic limit test to all fields. And you can see that the previously regular pattern of up and downs that we saw in the previous slide now here is irregular, becomes irregular because it represents, with the assumptions used, some fields going offline or reaching their end of their economic lives, and therefore that having an impact on the overall production for the basin. Here we can also restate the assumption shared earlier, which is that this represents a scenario where there are no additional investments, because one can argue that as a producer faces the situation of approaching the end of life, perhaps with additional investment that could be extended. Now, because we didn't have any information regarding those additional investments, and we wanted to focus more on the proved reserves, that this graph represents that approach rather than thinking of those additional investments. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this plot is our truncated forecast, and this is merely just a zoomed in shot of displaying of course our low, mid, high, and mean case. And in the green, as you can see, those are actuals, actual production that has produced through May 2023. And as you can see, it still falls within the band of our forecast. So again, it's just a zoomed in plot, gas rate versus time. Next slide, please. And so this next plot, this is our untruncated forecast plot. And this is just an alternate take. This is annualized volume of gas per year in billion cubic feet. Again, no economics are factored in this, but what you can see in the blue horizontal line, that is our assumed demand of 70 billion cubic feet used as a benchmark against our high, mid, low, and mean cases. Next slide, please. And again, this is our truncated forecast plot, and as you can see, the impacts to economics being factored along with the assumed flat demand of 70 billion cubic feet used as a benchmark. And I'll hand it over to Johnny for additional comments.
Thanks, John. Only to restate that assumption we mentioned as well, that the scope of the study was not to consider different scenarios for the demand of cooking the gas. That's another reason why the study considers the price profile that we could observe in some contracts that are publicly available between some producers and local utilities as a reflection of what the market is going to look like for the next few years, as that's the focus of the study in the shorter term, and how that forecasted production with the economic limit test could compare to an assumed constant demand profile of 70 billion cubic feet per year. Thanks, John. Next slide.
Okay, so this is a similar plot. Again, this is our untruncated mean case where we're isolating solely to our mean case. So you won't see our low, our mid, or our high case. So we are just solely isolated to the mean case for our untruncated forecast. And what you can see in the blue bars is the proved developed, currently producing well sets, and stacked on top of that is our incremental proved undeveloped volumes that were forecasted, and those are merely a reflection of the drilling pace development of 15 development wells per year. Next slide, please. And this is this next slide here is again annualized volume stacked against years, but this is our truncated case. Again, the blue bars reflecting currently producing forecast, meaning proved developed, and stacked on top of that, the orange bars are the incremental proved undeveloped. But this is the economics that are factored, and again, using that flat assumed demand of 70 billion cubic feet as a benchmark. And I'll hand it over to Johnny for any additional comments.
Thank you, John. Only to restate the importance of continued drilling here reflected by our assumption of 15 wells each year. But going back to the previous slide of how much of the recent production is represented by wells drilled in the past 10 to 20 years. Thank you. Next slide.
Okay, so these are this chart right here just is just a comparison of the studies and the outcomes of those respective studies starting in 2009. And what you see in the gray bars are cumulative gas produced volumes at the time of study, and on the top is the total estimated reserves that were concluded in each of those respective studies. And ultimately, the main takeaway for this very slide is each of these studies employed different methodologies. So I just want to make that distinction clear. And for our 2022 study, we had a cumulative production of approximately 8.8 trillion cubic feet. And our mean case in the red bar, again, we arrived at a total estimated reserves of 820 billion cubic feet. Adding the cumulative volume and the total estimated reserves, we arrived at approximately 9.7 trillion cubic feet of estimated ultimate recovery for the basin. Next slide, please. And this slide is just a reiteration of the previous slide that was noted earlier in the presentation. Two distinct studies, first being the USGS for undiscovered technically recoverable gas, and really the mean conventional gas and combining that with the mean unconventional gas, you arrive at approximately 19 trillion cubic feet for that distinct study for USGS. For BOEM, for the southernmost part of the Cook Inlet, considered the outer continental shelf, they evaluated and arrived at an additional mean resource of approximately 1.2 trillion cubic feet of gas. Next slide. I think that concludes our presentation. I'll hand it over to Deputy Commissioner John Crowther.
Yeah, thanks, folks. That's the presentation as prepared, but we're welcome questions and happy to answer any that have come up.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner and colleagues. With that, we'll now open up the floor for questions. And as a reminder, I'll be prioritizing questions from the task force committee members. Okay, we have a question from Representative Tom McKay about Are we hitting the 15 wells per year goal?
Yeah, I would, let's see if I'll flip back in the slide deck. I'll let Johnny or John speak to the exact number that we've seen in the 2022 and 2023 year. You know, I think for us, there's that wells drilled per year. We've seen activity this year consistent with that number. And then we've also seen, you know, the actual production for 2023 come in line. You know, it's obviously only 1 year within the year out from the study, but we've seen that production track estimated amounts associated with activities in existing fields. So John or Johnny, do you have specific well data? We can get back to the team with that.
Yeah, you know, I guess to account for the past few years, starting in 2020, we had a total of 11 development wells drilled in 2020. In 2021, there was 8 development wells drilled, and in 2022 there was 16 development wells drilled. So far in 2023, that's still being it's still a dynamic drilling pace that we're keeping a close watch of. But those are mainly captures the past few years in terms of development drilling pace. So I think it would be fair to say that our so far our assumption of 15 development wells drilled per year is aligned with what reality had presented starting in 2022, 2021, and 2020, 2021, and 2022. Sorry.
Thank you. And we have a question from Tony Izzo with Matanuska Electric. Tony, we might have to take you off mute to expand on this one, but the question in the chat is, how about policy impacts like those experienced in 2006 and 2015?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I think the perspective of the information that's been provided, but first, the quality is terrific. I greatly appreciate John and DNR's efforts, and having been involved in the Cook Inlet for 24 years, with NSTAR, with LNG export renewals, with ConocoPhillips, and now over the last decade or more with Matanuska Electric, I've seen a number of well-intended policies have a very negative, dramatic effect, and to me, that overlaying that perspective on the information is relevant to decision makers and task force members. I'll give you an example. While at NSTAR in 2002 and 3, we had realized that it was going to take a different type of gas contract. We were going to need an exploration type of contract where a producer, in this case, Unocal and Marathon, would have to invest significant dollars in an effort to achieve the results. In 2004 and 5, negotiated a contract with Marathon that was indexed on a 12-month trailing average of Henry Hub prices. That contract was announced in early 2005. The governor at that time told me that he didn't like it because we were not connected to the lower 48 in any physical way. Therefore, we shouldn't have a contract connected to lower 48 prices. Henry Hub was chosen in the contract because it's the most transparent. Alberta Hub sometimes has lower prices. They do right now, but you can't see all of the transactions, and we wanted it to be transparent. By that, actually, the governor's in his State of the State address that year, 2006, indicated that he was not in favor of any Henry Hub linked contracts. And by October of that year, it was Commissioner Price, Commissioner Guyard, and Commissioner Wilson who voted against the contract. So I was the CEO of NSTAR at that time. Marathon and other producers told me that they felt the state was closed for business and that they would be out by 2009. And that's exactly what happened. The second thing I've seen that I think is relevant over the timeline is that there was the Cook Inlet Recovery Act, which I believe was mentioned in the presentation. And that brought all kinds of new players. And of course, there were the tax credits. And I'm not saying that I'm in favor of or against the 1.3 billion in tax credits. But the reality is it brought in 13 plus new players. I was now at Matanuska Electric in 2015, negotiated a 10-year contract for $5 gas with a new party. And we were at the board table signing term sheets when their phones rang and their lenders like ING had just been informed that Governor Walker had vetoed the tax credits. That statute allowed for 92% borrowing. And again, I'm not saying one is, it was the right thing to do, but there was a decision made at a high level, policy and law that was passed that brought in a number of players based on a certain number of conditions. And when the tax credits were vetoed, they could no longer borrow. And so they left the state. And what most people don't realize is that has taken 10 million a year out of the the Mat-Su economy after tax every year since then. That was a 10-year contract, 2015. It was a combination 10-year contract with another larger utility. And so I imagine that the overall impact was probably more like a couple $100 million at least over a 10-year period. The Marathon contract that was denied by the commission in 2006, it's estimated or was estimated at the time to have probably taken $1 billion out of the economy in higher prices. Again, these are not fun things to talk about, but I experienced them directly. And I just think that there's a lesson to be learned about making decisions without all of the inputs and understanding the consequences as we kind of shift and head off in a different direction. It's important that we measure the results of these things and learn from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And John, not sure if you want to respond to that or if there is a quick response. We are running out of time here.
Yeah, happy to speak very briefly to that. I think those are two, I think fair to say kind of inflection points in the market. I think the department's general understanding, it's fair to say that, the denial of those contracts now going back 20 years did result in the disapproval of those contracts, which resulted in other contracting structures around gas, which resulted in those companies, Unical and Marathon, leaving the inlet according to the schedule roughly schedule you described, Mr. Izzo. And we then saw Hillcore start to acquire assets from those same companies around that time. So I think that's very accurately all the different dynamics that went into that pivot and change in the market are very relevant for analysis. And then similarly, this slide that I'm sharing right now does just captures two facets, right, of the change in the different tax and credit incentive structures and the different activities you see throughout time. So I think both those are examples for analysis, but the point is very well taken and that's why we in our presentation today talked about what our forecast is and what our forecast isn't in the kind of totality of policy making and decision making for utilities, for gas providers, for the legislature and the governor as policy leaders. there is a full suite of information that needs to be considered. Our forecast is certainly part of that, an important technical analysis part of that. But there's many other factors and the consequences and second order effects of those factors that need to be carefully considered. So I think it's always good to highlight that history and what we can and should learn from it when looking at where we are today. I'm not sure, Mr. Izzo, if there were specific additional points in the forecast that you thought should be discussed in the context of those lessons, but we'd be happy to do so if needed.
Thanks, Deputy Commissioner. We've got one more question from task force members. And again, I'm not sure if we'll be able to provide an answer to this one, but Jen Miller asked with renewable independent power producers, if the majority of electricity generation were met with other sources, how long could kick in that gas supply meet heat demand? I think it's important to get this one on the record so folks can think about it. But Deputy Commissioner, do you want to take a swing at that, or should we leave it there? Because that one's a hard one to answer.
Yeah, I'll try, and this will be difficult for me. I'll try and think of an illustrative slide to pull up at the same time I talk about this. And that may overtax my brain, so I'll probably start focusing on talking first. And it's a little bit about what our forecast is, and it's a very good point. It's probably one of the things we should have included in our key assumptions slide, where we acknowledge, that we don't assume the development wells continue after 2030, not because we don't think there'll be any drilling, but because that 15, we thought the reasonable tranche was up until 2030. We assume that the gas price is flat, changing with escalation. We assume that additional prospects for gas are not brought into development. We just didn't analyze that one way or the other. But very importantly, we didn't assume that there were alternatives, either in response to supply limitations, price responsiveness, technology availability, or whatever other factors that caused some energy switching, so to speak. And that's something that is very relevant for analysis. For natural gas derived heating, there's a very different dynamic there than some aspects of electricity generation. But we did not do analysis of how that would change the results of our forecast. I will say, and I'm sorry to flip through these so quickly. I will say when we look at this slide, we can see demand historically for Cook Inlet gas, and we can see things like the commercial use in Cook Inlet, the electric power use in Cook Inlet, residential use, oil and gas field operations. Each one of those tranches that we see has a different kind of responsiveness to switching. And so you can see some elements of that in the 60 to 70 assumed BCF per year demand that could change over the future. The thing I would say is that, and this is a limitation of our forecast, the complex economic realities, if you saw switching and diversification in some of these different kinds of cost strata, fixed costs, operating costs, capital investment costs, some of them would continue to be applied across if there was a smaller demand portfolio. So that's a very complex analysis that our forecast did not attempt to capture or analyze, but it is relevant to the dialogue. So it's a good question and a good thing to be thinking of for sure.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. With that, I think we will give ourselves a 3-minute break. I do want to say that Tony does also he wants a response to Jen's question. So we will bring Tony back, give folks a break, and then at 12:05, we will start up with Lisa's presentation. So
thank you everyone for the time.
Thank you, John.
This is Tony Izzo again. To Jen's question, I've had the analysis done. Jen, the electric demand ranges between 22 and 25 billion cubic feet per year. of natural gas, which provides about 85% of the power. The remainder is for the most part hydro. If we could just airlift a 400 megawatt firm generation with a 90% capacity factor, in theory, with 400 megawatts, 90% capacity factor, would be of non-natural gas firm capacity, would eliminate that 22 to 25 billion cubic feet a year that could be diverted for home heating. NSTAR's average annual demand, again, subject to weather, can be plus or minus 3 BCF, is about 35 billion cubic feet. With 90% capacity factor, I would still need to keep the thermal generation ready, because we need to have 30% of spinning reserve. And for maintenance cycles, I would either need 600 megawatts firm capacity or peak firm capacity at 90% capacity factor to completely eliminate the need for natural gas, but essentially 400 would do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And again, we'll give ourselves a 4-minute break and we'll start Lisa's presentation at 12:05.
And Jeremy and the team, is it appropriate if we stay on as panelists, just muted and with our cameras off? I may listen to the other presentations as my schedule allows.
Yes, that's fine.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we are back from our short break. Next up, we have Lisa Wilcox with BRG. Thank you, Lisa. The floor is yours.
I just want to, hello, let me turn on my camera. And I just want to make sure that the sound is okay and that I'm sharing the full page version, the presentation version of the slide.
Sound is great, and we are seeing the full screen.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Lisa Wilcox. I'm director at BRG. I will be doing most of the presentation. However, with me, I have Ina Johansson from NSTAR, and I believe she wanted to do the intro.
Yes, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And first of all, thank you, DNR. The presentation was very comprehensive and very in line with our findings as well. So my name is Ina Johansson, and I'm a director of NSTAR Gas Supply Operations. And I want to start off by introducing Lisa Wilcox with Berkeley Research Group. Like she said, she'll be doing most of the presentation. But I would like also to recognize other utilities and agencies who are members of our gas supply working group. Homer Electric, Matanuska Electric, Golden Valley, Chugach Electric, IGU, Department of Natural Resources as well, in Alaska Energy Authority. I believe most of them, they're representative on this call as well. So I appreciate getting to know these individuals and working with them. And over the last year, we spent many hours together assessing the current and future state of gas supply market and Cook Inlet. We debate, we challenge each other, and we have come up with a very strong process that is supported by all of our organizations. And that is critical. Before I turn over to Lisa, I wanted to provide a brief background to everyone of why we're here today. Last April, Hilcorp brought all the customers together to inform us that they are no longer have line of sight on what supply would look like from the Cook Inlet. And because of that fact, they no longer had the ability to extend gas supply contracts at the same levels that they are today. It is very clear to all of us that they're continuing to invest in the inlet, but it is to meet existing contractual obligations only, not for supply needs beyond existing contracts. So it was after that meeting, all utilities kind of got together and began evaluating the situation and what our next steps would be. Now, since NSTAR was founded in 1959, we have contracted with almost every producer who has been operated in Cook Inlet. And currently we have contracts with Vision Resources, Blue Crest, Fury, and our largest producer supplier, Hilcorp Alaska. And I want to take this moment in this public settings to say something about Hilcorp. Hilcorp is the kind of producer we want in this state. They have been a great partner who truly strives to understand the needs of their customers. They have made significant amount of investment in our state and in its economy. And frankly, we need more companies here like them. They didn't have to communicate with us back in April of last year, but they were good corporate citizens and wanted to make sure that we are all able to plan accordingly. We would have sufficient amount of time to figure out a solution to the looming gas supply shortage. And because now we can, now we are. So back to the issue at hand. We fully acknowledge that the current issue we're facing is fundamentally a public policy issue. It impacts all of us. Utilities enter into gas supply agreements with producers. Those contracts essentially are approved by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. And then the costs are passed directly through our customers, through us to our customers. These costs compound and they become part of the annual budgets of every company and resident that we provide service. And we fully realize the implication of any increase in costs for South Central. We have had many conversations with political leaders, and we appreciate Governor Dunleavy's creation of the Energy Security Task Force. And we're working toward a solution that mitigates, not compounds, the energy security in our state. The bottom line, we're at the point in our state's history where we have the opportunity to develop a comprehensive long-term plan that sets a future generation for success. And it will take all of us to make it happen. And with that, Lisa, she is an Alaskan who is previously served as a vice president at the Alaska Gaslight Development Corporation. The reason we decided to work with Lisa, she intuitively understands both the importance of this project as well as its complexity. She will explain the work her team, under the guidance of Instar and the working group, performed, completed in phase 1, and also will kind of give a preview of phase 2 of their work that has already begun. All right, Lisa, take up.
All right, thank you, Ina. Ina, thank you so much for the introduction. It is an honor to present to the Strategic Energy Task Force, and we will be happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation as well. This is the same presentation that we made at the Regulatory Commission of Alaska on the 28th of June when the report was released. And there's also, multi-page report with appendices that is available on NSTAR's website that provides more details of this work, of this phase 1 work. Just to do, Ina did my introduction. As she mentioned, I've worked in the Alaska energy industry for many years, for over 20 years. My work experience includes working with BP and working on various gas pipeline projects to monetize Alaska gas. For the last 3 years, I have worked with BRG, and I've worked remotely from Anchorage. BRG is an international group of experts, and we provide both advisory and dispute-related, contractual dispute-related services and litigation-related services in many areas. In my area in particular, I work in our energy and climate practice, and on this engagement with NSTAR and the utilities, it's our energy and climate and then project development advisory practices that are combining forces to provide this evaluation, to provide the service. So those practices combine gas and LNG market, commercial, contractual, project financing expertise, and technical project development and project management systems. We have experts with deep experience all over the world, in North America, in evaluation development of LNG terminals, regas terminals, utility infrastructure, and major project management. So our company is able to pull in, experts in various fields as needed into the project. So that's just a little bit about BRG because it's not a company that's particularly well known in Alaska. As far as the study itself, or the phase 1 work itself, just flip back to my presentation. The scope of phase 1, and why is it called phase 1, was to provide an objective evaluation of the most viable, or what we consider the most realistic options of this issue of filling potentially large chunks of current natural gas demand in Alaska. And we started with a list of 10 options, as you will see, and we applied objective scoring criteria to use the cost estimates at the screening level at this time to whittle them down to the best 3 or 4 options that we can continue working and actually progressing and enable the utilities to make a decision on them in the near future. So that's the process that we're now undergoing in phase 2 on a shorter list of options, but this initial work included a screening study on all of them, or on the list of 10. Let's see if I can. So I'll start with the key conclusions of this phase 1. And as you saw in the DNR presentation, and I won't dwell on it too much in this because we have the benefit of DNR presenting right in front of us, is that the utilities do not see that Cook Inlet gas on a risk-weighted basis can meet demand forecast beyond 2026. And that's assuming current proved reserves And then assuming some development of undeveloped, or I should say beyond proved reserves, so that's probable reserves and beyond, or even undiscovered reserves. Again, when we look at risk-weighted forecast of it, we see the shortage coming sometime in the early to mid 2030s. And that's in regards to the local supply, that was a basic conclusion of the study. So while Cook Inlet gas remains important, it remains very important even to this project to continue to develop those undeveloped proved reserves and potentially fill in the gaps with further field developments. The utilities decided that other options must be pursued in order to have the lead time to actually implement them. In that regard, since other options tend to be newer, more complex, have a longer project time development window, it is vital that the Alaska utilities have control of the pace of that option development so that they can actually address the impending gas shortage. So several viable options to supplement the Cook Inlet gas supply and to eventually replace the Cook Inlet gas supply, as the forecasts indicate, need to progress further in the next phase, and that's what we're working on at the moment. And that phase is expected to be completed roughly by the end of 2023, so that decisions can be made shortly thereafter in first or second quarter of 24. Now I'll turn to the basic assumptions of this phase one evaluation. The first one and the basic assumptions are, the demand and the supply as we try to balance them out. So the long-term natural gas demand for the interconnected gas utilities, or for interconnected gas and power utilities, I should say, was actually estimated by the utilities themselves. So DNR presentation mentioned that they did not, they did not actually do a detailed demand study. So this is something that the utilities did in this phase one work. And that demand forecast provides a basis for the capacity planning assumptions for any new project that comes into the energy mix. So the basic forecast is NSTAR remains with a stable gas demand for heating. So that's about 30 BCF per year. And then other utilities, electric utilities, continue to an extent to rely on natural gas. So electric utilities have some renewables that come into their portfolio, but also they continue to rely on natural gas. And then in fact, Golden Valley has plans to increase its reliance on natural gas generated electricity in its system. And I'll talk about the range of potential renewable power replacements that the utilities looked at in the process. Beneficial electrification here refers to switching energy sources for things like cars that currently do not rely on natural gas to power, which of course then would increase the demand for power in general, for power consumption in general, and with assumption that at least some of the power is still generated by natural gas, it would also naturally increase the demand for natural gas. We had high, medium, and low demand forecasts that represented reasonable expectations of the electric utilities themselves, and included timelines for clean energy uptake, and then also included a range of warm winters versus cold winters, just for planning purposes. So on the supply side, we used, from the presentation you saw, DNR's 2022 Cook Inlet mean truncated supply forecast as kind of our base assumption. And this is under current market conditions with current market prices. So this is what we expect Cook Inlet to deliver for future gas. I should mention that proved reserves coming from Cook Inlet is not equal to contracted Cook Inlet reserves. So there is a difference between 2027 and 2040 in total of about 290 BCF in the forecast. So we expect proved reserves in Cook Inlet to be developed at current market prices. However, that gas has not yet been contracted. So that's an important thing to remember and kind of an additional risk in the system. And then DNR anticipates, again, just under their basic forecast, this mean truncated forecast, to have that gas supply gap between the approved reserves profile and the current demand to develop in 2027. I noted in the presentation some of their other variations of the forecast, and we saw fairly similar numbers. I believe in the high case it was 2030, in the untruncated mean case also 2030, but that's the general neighborhood of when they expect a gap to develop. So we use the mean truncated case, it's 2027. And then we in our study used 2018 gas availability study, also done by DNR. And that's the scope of work that was not included in this updated forecast. And that's to estimate what incremental Cook Inlet supply could be developed beyond proved reserves and what are the price levels beyond that base case. So that's what we used as really our option one, and that's development of additional Cook Inlet supply beyond proved reserves to meet the gap. The result of all of that assumptions, the results of all of those assumptions are on this slide. We have the dark blue bars, which are DNR truncated mean case supply from the 2023 forecast. Then we have the light blue and the yellow bars. That's potential incremental Cook Inlet supply that we used as essentially option one in our forecast. And that just entailed shaping, using using logic to shape the potential reserves that were listed in the 2018 gas availability numbers, which was a total of about 200 billion cubic feet. So we shaped, what those production profiles might look like as they're developed. And there seem to be two different distinct chunks of reserves where you kind of saw an incline in the price curve. So we separated those reserves, by what we saw as the potential price levels, which indicate kind of the complexity of the development of these reserves or the riskiness of them. And then on the contracted supply side, that's the green line. So the difference between the green line and the dark blue bars, as I mentioned, is the 290 billion cubic feet that's essentially not contracted yet from the approved reserves. And then the two lines at the top are the ranges of the combination of NSTAR and the electric utilities low and high demand with all those base assumptions that I mentioned. There's some incorporation of renewables. There's some increase for natural gas demand from utilities that are actually planning to increase their reliance on natural gas demand. And then there's some beneficial electrification incorporated. And I know this is an area that draws a lot of questions from all of us as we kind of enter into the era of increasing our reliance on renewable generation in Alaska. We already have a fairly significant chunk of our electric generation that's relying on renewables, primarily hydro, but some wind as well, and a little bit of solar. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, that's a question that's probably best answered by the electric utilities themselves. But in our report, we reflected their analysis of what might be the lower and the upper bound of gas requirements just for the electric utilities. So you see numbers on the y-axis here that are significantly lower than the demand that we're actually counting. So this excludes NSTAR and heating utilities, IGU. So the dotted lines are the upper and lower bounds that are dependent on the pace of adoption of renewable power generation. And then the lines in the middle, the solid lines, are our demand forecasts. So we picked a range so that, or the utilities, I should say, picked a range for those demand forecasts that included some step down in natural gas demand. That again is a reasonable expectation and something that can actually be used for project development so that we know what the capacity of a project might be, because there is quite a bit of uncertainty in the pace at which renewable power will replace natural gas. Now I can talk about the actual methodology of the study, and that is addressing, how do we develop the option, the scope of each of the options to deliver additional natural gas into the system, and what did we use to screen them. So we, as I mentioned, we have 10 options that we'll go through, and what we did is adopted a scope from project developers if it's an option that is being actively pursued. One example is Alaska LNG. We just adopted the scope from Alaska LNG, adopted the cost estimates from Alaska LNG, or used information in the market that is public for projects that are actually being pursued, so that we wouldn't spend the effort and when there's no need to create something that's already been created. And then in other cases, we actually did a screening level cost estimate that's primarily for LNG import projects that at least needed to be updated from previous efforts. So we developed, in that way, we developed conceptual scope and cost estimates for those options. And then we estimated the cost of supply on the same basis in 2023 dollars using consistent volumes for the capacity of those projects. We essentially came up with levelized rates for 20 years and then discounted them back to 2023 dollars. Then aside from just looking at the cost, the utilities wanted to have an objective and prioritize systems of how do you score the different options. So the working group of the utilities, and that's the part of the group that, that included the demand group, not so much DNR and Alaska Energy Authority. They worked up a prioritization schedule of what is important in delivering each of these options. So, and then based on these priorities, the score of each option was then assigned a weight on these categories. And each option had a score of 1 to 5 in each of these categories. And then we, assigned a weight based on priority and then multiplied them through and came up with a score. So you will see those scores later on, but this is the prioritized criteria for selection of the options. And each utility filled out their own matrix, discussed it internally. We consolidated them and then suggested a kind of a resulting prioritization. So that's how it resulted based on the input we got. Obviously, there were some differences between utilities in how they viewed, flexibility versus, project complexity and how they ranked it, and that depended in some sense on how they understood it. But uniformly, the top 3 priorities was schedule risk, and schedule risk was defined as the ability of the project to deliver sufficient gas to fill the demand gap by, the time period that we estimate that the demand gap occurs, which is 2027, 2028 timeframe. So that's really what schedule risk is, and that's, can you actually execute a project in time that you need the gas? And then second was the reliability of that supply during operations, and the third was the delivered cost of supply per MCF. And that on the 2023 kind of aligned basis. So, and then of course there were other priorities that impacted the score that you can see on here. So now I can go through the actual list of the options that we considered and essentially the inputs that went into the scoring of each of these options. So I'll just explain the table as there's a lot of information on here. You have the first column is just the number of the option. It doesn't mean anything. It's not a score. It's just a numbering system that we use. Then the description of the option, then as we see now, the timeline from making a decision at the year end of 2023 to actually having this gas online. These numbers, along with everything to the right of it, is likely to change as the prioritized options are developed further, as we continue to refine the estimates. But this is the screening level timeline. I should say, we spent quite a bit of time on columns, the timeline column and then the capital investment column amongst the utilities, and also cooperated with particularly Chugach Electric and their consultant Black & Veatch that was working independently on some of the same solutions. So some of these numbers were actually adjusted on the basis of working through them with the group, and we kind of came so that we could come to a consensus. So capital investment is the total capital investment in the option, which may not be the investment that the utilities actually need to make, but it's just it reflects the sticker number of total cost. Supply volume, and that's billion cubic feet per year. That was for the corresponding capital investment. So some of these options are expandable, some are not, but the supply volume is aligned with the size of the investment. And then finally, the last three columns are the estimated cost of supply. The ranges here, for the most part, reflect the denominator of whether we're using the low demand or the high demand. They do not include things like cost uncertainty. And as you can imagine, for a lot of these projects, there's still quite a bit of cost uncertainty in the estimate itself. And they also do not reflect, potential price volatility, depending on how the gas is contracted. Price volatility, on its own is not, may or may not be a big concern because there are mitigations, there's, hedging that can be done and so forth. But just as a disclaimer, when we estimate, for example, the cost of gas for LNG import options of $8.60 to $8.90, we recognize that the actual cost of buying gas on the market is likely to have significantly higher range over the time of the contract. And then, so the price of gas is for the purchase of gas at the point that it's purchased. So in some cases, it's in the market or in Cook Inlet, and in other cases, it's wherever it's being bought, for example, in Canada for LNG imports. And then midstream is the investment in the midstream infrastructure to get it here and to inject it into the Cook Inlet pipeline system, so then it can flow to storage or flow to the customers. It does not include distribution costs or any additional storage costs. So, and then that gives you kind of the total range of MCF. I'll run down the list of options very quickly. So Cook Inlet gas is the development of those incremental reserves beyond proved reserves that we see possible. And we mostly used 2018 Department of Natural Resource availability numbers to actually make that estimate. We did not do a bottom-up forecast of reserves or anything. The high range per MCF reflects some uncertainty. It reflects in the facts that some of these reserves are not developed, and the returns that the investors will require to actually develop them at this point, have a significant amount of uncertainty. And it's also reflecting the fact that it's a mix of, possibly onshore and offshore gas, so the range could be quite broad. Then in-state pipeline option, I'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. So you notice that we have a two-way option. So on the next slide, we'll have, 2B and C. So in this particular variation, an in-state pipeline is a privately developed project that basically supplies the utilities' unmet gas demand. So it does not include any additional export projects. It does not include, for example, potential Donlin mine demand that the DNR presentation that Johnny mentioned, and the cost of it, the high cost of it, reflects that reality, that an in-state pipeline, even if built, to kind of the minimum, to the minimum cost possible. And here, for example, it excludes the gas treatment facility because we assume that the gas is actually taken at Point Thompson, therefore does not need the extensive CO2 removal that Prudhoe Bay gas requires. It still delivers a fairly high cost of supply because of the size of the demand. Then the next 1, 2, 3, 4 options are variations of exports. So number 3 is retrofitting the Kenai LNG facility to be an import facility, but actually delivering a significantly higher volume than Marathon subsidiary is currently applying to FERC or has been approved by FERC to import. Then greenfield port and regas means building a greenfield site, which of course has we've estimated has a longer time development time frame and costs a bit more. But it's not a significant, it's not material difference in the cost, I would say, from Kenai LNG, because we're still planning that even with the retrofit of Kenai LNG, at some point, new storage would need to be installed. So that's the big part of that $768 million estimate. And then FSRU, that's floating storage and regas unit. That's a variation of an import project where instead of on-land storage, you use a floating storage that could actually be used early on while you have low demand to also transport the LNG. But again, that floating storage needs a place to moor. It needs a dock. So option 5 presumes that we're using existing facilities, so we're not building a new dock to house that FSRU. A barge and small LNG carrier is kind of the same as the FSRU option, but it involves much smaller ships, not the standard size ships in the market, and basically you increase the number of ships as you go, as your demand grows. It's a flexible option. However, sometimes it's actually more difficult to get the supply in a ship that's non-standard. Also, they have to, they potentially have to be custom built, or most likely. And then you also have to kind of keep up with your growing demand by bringing in more and more ships. So in the end, this option didn't score extremely highly. Alaska LNG, I won't spend too much time on, but it's obviously the most economic option because it relies on the economies of scale, and that's the one option on this list, or one of the bigger options on this list that actually utilities don't really have the power to sanction and go forward with it. But we felt it was still important to include it. It does have, as you see, the time development time frame that's a bit longer than we estimate, at least some of the others. And LNG truck and or rail has, as we evaluated it, turned really into an LNG trucking option. And this one is leveraging the information from the contract that IGU concluded with Harvest Midstream on the North Slope to liquefy natural gas from Prudhoe Bay and then to ship it to Fairbanks. So in this case, that option would be expanded. It would need an infrastructure investment that sounds central to store and regas that LNG. And obviously there's the issue of potentially a large amount of traffic on the highways to make that work. And thus it has a bit of a natural volume limitation, we judged. So that's why it's on the list, and that's why its costs are still relatively high. And then the last 2 options, renewable natural gas and hydrogen. Renewable natural gas, its basic limitation is volume. It's using natural gas from wastewater facilities and from landfill facilities that we just don't have that many of in Alaska, and they're not of the scale that can really fill this gap. So while those may be very good projects, and we already have some, and some are going forward, you know, that BCF, 1 BCF per year is approximately what we estimated would be possible. And green hydrogen, we evaluated green hydrogen. Black and Veatch also included blue hydrogen in their evaluation. The limitation on green hydrogen primarily is the uncertainty and time for when it could be implemented, what power source it would use, because if we're relying on power that's still generated by natural gas, then we're not really, you know, we're not really helping ourselves on the natural gas shortage. So that's why you see kind of the large time development time frame, and still at this point, potential high cost considering the demand for power. And actually one of our assumptions is that you can install an electrolyzer using federal subsidies, but it still has significant operating costs due to power use. So that's the basic summary of the options. And I'm sure we'll probably have some questions on them. So, and on this slide, we have summarized, let me just do a time check. Yeah, we have summarized the modeling of several of the options, assuming some subsidies or some participation from a government entity in these options. So 2A, you saw the in-state pipeline as a privately financed venture. 2B and 2C reflect different levels of subsidies, and that's just something that clients ask us to model to show the difference in the cost of supply. The 2B option is an 80% subsidy, so that effectively excludes 80% of the capital costs from the rate base. And then 2C is a state-owned project that then has a return on investment to the state that's assumed at about, I believe, 200 million per year. But then it really doesn't have a rate base that's included in the project. So there are two different ways to structure projects like this, should there be benefits that were considered in the in-state pipeline beyond just the cost of supply itself. And then just to show a similar picture, we did the same for the greenfield port and regas option to show the resulting cost of supply. And in that case, obviously the upfront investment is significantly lower for just the cost of the terminal, but however, you continue to pay in the market for gas. So assuming that you're not subsidizing the gas purchase, the cost of supply stays higher than the pipeline option. As we went through the scoring methodology, these are the options that came out as the top 4, and they're the options that we are initially starting phase 2 with some disclaimers on the part as we kind of find out more, as we refine the estimates, and I'll actually cover them from the bottom up. So Cook Inlet gas supply is something that BRG specifically is not really involved in. That's something that the utilities continue to do, as they still have work to do to contract for the remaining proved reserves, as well as potentially help develop incremental reserves in Cook Inlet gas. It was a top scoring option, but it's something that's not really an engineering project in itself for us. Then floating storage and regas unit came out as and both C and B use existing infrastructure. So these options have the advantage of potentially speeding up the calendar, speeding up the schedule of any project that's installed. That's always been recognized in previous studies as well. So we will work with the owners of the infrastructure on Kenai to see what cooperation we can achieve, what can be done, what costs actually, what the costs of those projects are, and also we'll conduct an outreach to the market and really try to refine the costs of both the supply and shipping of the commodity. On the in-state pipeline, as we saw, the privately financed project really does not compete with our demand levels with a lot of other options. So this remains a potential project where where we participate, where we provide data. We work with AGDC to see if we can find a solution. But again, it's not a focus for our engineering effort in this phase 2, as much as projects that can actually be executed by the utilities. So these are the weighted results of all of the options. So out of the maximum score of 5, out of those 10 prioritized categories, this is how they came out. So in dark blue, you can see those top scoring options with the in-state pipeline with some level of subsidy coming out on top. However, with the 275 score as a private investment because of its high cost of supply. Cook Inlet gas supply, well, I should say Cook Inlet gas supply is the highest score, but it's in a different color because, as I said, that's not something that our project is really delivering. It's something the utilities are working on. And then Kenai LNG and FSRU had very similar scores. And in between them is the Greenfield Port and regas, which, to the extent that Kenai LNG and FSRU turn out to be viable options, and really that can be delivered in a short time frame. I think Greenfield Port and regas will remain in the background, but we're ready to bring it back due to the time frame that we have to make this project work. So with all of that, I'll just summarize the recommendations and the next steps. I believe I have a couple of slides on this, and then we can go to the questions. Not to repeat myself, the utilities will individually continue to develop Cook Inlet gas supply, to contract with Cook Inlet gas supply, so that process will go on independently for the most part through the regular confidential negotiations and working and then submitting results to the RCA. The working group will pursue these top scoring options that I just described. And finally, we will refine the cost of supply estimates over the next few months for these 3 top scoring options, and also develop a project execution and procurement strategy, so that when the utilities are ready to make the decision on them, the project is actually ready to go. Then we will the cost estimates will be refined to about pre-feed study, which is, I think, plus or minus 20%, 20 to 30% certainty level. And then we will complete permitting due diligence for all of these top scoring options to see if we've missed anything, if there's some key bottlenecks, and that will obviously affect the schedule that we present in the end. And also we will work with the utilities to figure out, well, who's investing them? What is the model? Who will actually own any infrastructure and contract for it? What's best to finance these projects? What's the lowest cost option to create project financing structures? And then finally, we hope to identify one permanent solution, but as I'm sure you can see in the balance of supply and demand, that may not be feasible. So short-term options may also need to be implemented or recommended depending on the outcome of this phase 2 work. So I think that concludes the study for the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Wilcox. With that, we'll now open the floor for questions. Just a reminder, I'll prioritize questions from the task force members. And then there is one that came up. I'll read it here. Ina answered it in the chat, but maybe if you get you on the recording answering that would make things easier for the folks. But the question was from Ms. Miller. Would you please further define the ranking criteria for reliability of supply during operations?
Okay. Let's see. Short of go into the report is a cheat sheet. Oh, excuse me. the reliability of supply during operations is basically it's the ability to count on the gas that we actually contract for. So, and one example that I can give is that our reliability of supply, short of a couple of crisis points in Cook Inlet, has been extremely high. I don't think we've ever had a true shortage. I know we had one situation where we had brownouts. The utilities can speak to that better than I can, but in general, the reliability of supply in Cook Inlet has been really high. The farther away your gas comes from, there are potential bottlenecks that start to occur. But a lot of that also depends on the way you contract for it. If you contract in the spot market and you're relying on just going from kind of one cargo to the next, and you don't know which one is coming next, or you're only a couple of months out from finding one, then we ranked those options, lower on reliability than if you have a long-term contract, or we would rank them that way. So there's potential to establish reliability of supply very well for almost any option, but we try to take a realistic view of, okay, what does this one actually deliver, and what risks in the system may prevent that reliability from being 100%.
Thank you. Sorry, as I balance screens here, trying to answer and address all the questions, but we have a question from Isaac Vandenberg. Can you provide further detail on your cost breakdown for green hydrogen? Curious what financing structures, rebates, incentives, and cost of renewable generation you included.
Yeah, and it's a very good question. As I mentioned, we took a fairly generous view on green hydrogen, and that's actually assuming that the cost of the electrolyzer will be covered with rebates or subsidies. So the cost of the electrolyzer itself for producing the hydrogen using water is zero. We also didn't really assume any costs for getting that water. So securing water rights or securing a site, it's a zero capital project cost. What we did assume is using kind of current assumptions on the technology that producing green hydrogen requires power, and the range of costs that we used for power is $70 to $80 per megawatt hour. So that's and that was actually subject of a discussion with the electric utilities of what a reasonable wholesale power cost we use. We looked at current prices, which are a lot of them are significantly higher than that, and kind of assumed some savings in the future for particularly green power projects. So it's really the operating costs of hydrogen that we're looking at.
Thanks. Another question from Jen Miller. Does the FSRU option have less brownfield project risk compared to the Kenai LNG? And then there's a follow-up to that one. What do you see as the major trade-offs between those two options?
Another excellent question. So the FSRU option does, the reason that we go to that is the brownfield risk with the current on-site land storage is what you would eliminate with the FSRU option, because as we know, the tanks in the Kenai LNG facility are quite old. The ultimate ability to use those tanks for the full demand that you would need is uncertain. And the tanks were built for smaller vessels than are standard in the market. So there may be things that you have to do to maybe not deliver full loads, to have the ship, come in and then go out, waiting for regas to happen. So in that sense, FSRU does create significantly less risk, because you can basically, so long as you can fit it at the dock, you can get the size that you want. And you can reliably store the LNG as it's done in many locations, and regas it at the rate that you need it. So obviously it has some other issues, and that's primarily permitting an FSRU vessel to sit in Cook Inlet, which we haven't really had in the past.
Thank you, Lisa. With that, we've got 5 minutes to go, and if folks don't mind, I think we can end the questions there and give everybody a 5-minute break. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You.
Welcome back. Next up, we have Mr. Frank Richards from the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation. Frank, the floor is yours. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Jerry. Members of the task force, co-chairs, I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to provide you an update on the opportunity that we call the Alaska LNG project. So I will start to share my screen. Okay. All right, everybody. Again, I'm here to talk about the Alaska LNG project. This is the project that AGDC was given rights to previously to be able to commercialize our North Slope natural gas resources. But before I start talking specifically about the project, I wanted to give you an indication of who we are as the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation. And that is that we are an independent public corporation that was created by the state of Alaska about 10 years ago, when we were in the same situation of looking at declining Cook Inlet natural gas reserves and looking for the opportunities to be able to access those North Slope natural gas resources and bring them down to be used for South Central Alaska and Interior Alaska, specifically in the Fairbanks and the North Star Borough. We were given a mission by the legislature to maximize the benefit of those North Slope resources through development of infrastructure to move the gas to, again, Alaskans and to the international markets. Our first project that we looked at was, again, a bullet line that was within the state of Alaska called the Alaska Standalone Pipeline Project. And this was an iteration that was previously developed or was being worked by NSTAR and handed over to AGDC to move the project through concept selection and ultimately through design to see if it was economically achievable. We did that from 2012 through 2015. We completed a level of effort called pre-feed and FEED, front-end engineering and design, and came up with a cost estimate of about $10 billion to condition the gas and then move it down by a 36-inch diameter pipeline to Fairbanks in South Central Alaska. But the economics of that were challenged, again, as you just heard from Lisa, the low population and without significant subsidization by the state of Alaska, it would have been a really high cost of supply going into those communities. So we put that project on hold, while at the same time we were given the responsibility and focus to shift onto the representation for the state of Alaska in the Alaska LNG project. And that is the large scale commercialization of those North Slope resources, where Alaskans would gain the benefit of the lower cost volumes, a lower cost of supply due to the high volumes that would be pushed through the project for liquefaction and export to the Asian markets. But the Alaska LNG project that we inherited and what we have today is not the same. We've made significant changes in terms of the commercial structure. We've looked for optimizations within the project. We've looked for ways to bring the gas down to Alaskans at a lower cost, and to make sure that we are economic and cost competitive in the world market, because that's the only way this project will be built, is through private enterprise taking on the project to move it through to actually execution and operation. But along the way, we went through and have completed a rigorous environmental study. So we made sure that the mitigations and the requirements necessary for this project to actually be constructed and operated will meet the rigorous standards of Alaskans, as well as the federal authorizations that were necessary to obtain that. And through the time frame when we were given the project in 2017 to today, we've now received all of our major federal authorizations and permits, allowing us to construct this project. So the project is indeed a very large scope. It relies on the Prudhoe Bay and Point Thompson units, the oil and gas units on the North Slope, where there's 40 trillion cubic feet of stranded gas. As you may have heard before, Prudhoe Bay produces about 8.5 billion standard cubic feet of natural gas a day as they produce oil, along with the associated water. That natural gas is then compressed and re-injected back down into the reservoir. So that 8.5 billion cubic feet has been cycled for the last 45 to 50 years as Prudhoe Bay development has brought us the oil and the oil wealth associated with it. Point Thompson is to the east, and that's where there's approximately 9 trillion cubic feet of natural gas available. ExxonMobil led a project where they're providing natural gas liquids off of that field. And the surprise opening up Point Thompson with the major gas sale will be an increase of those liquid volumes from approximately 6,500 barrels a day now to 60,000+ barrels a day. So better revenue stream for both the state of Alaska and producers. But between those two fields, there's more than 30 years worth of supply to be able to meet the needs of the Alaska LNG project for in-state needs as well as for export. It consists of what we call an Arctic carbon capture plant, where the two combined gas streams would be coming out of the central gas facility, would then be conditioned to remove the carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. That equates to approximately 400 million standard cubic feet a day of carbon dioxide, which will be sequestered into the Prudhoe Bay Reservoir for sequestration or enhanced oil recovery. That now has a value that has been placed on it by the IRA, which allows for tax credits under the IRS tax code to the plant operator at approximately $85 per ton of CO2 for sequestration. So what we're seeing is that this now will generate about $600 million a year of revenue for the project, for the waste stream that will be reinjected and sequestered into the reservoir. So that's been a very positive aspect in terms of cost of supply. At the outlet of the carbon capture plant will be the 807-mile pipeline. This is a 42-inch high-pressure pipeline with 8 compressor stations along the way. It will be buried, and it will have temperature control to make sure that the gas pipeline will not impact negatively the permafrost and discontinuous permafrost areas. That was built into the design, and that was one of the major environmental concerns that were mitigated through our design efforts. But along the way, there'll be opportunities for Alaskans and Alaskan communities and Alaska resource enterprises and developments to have access to that gas, because that was one of our major missions, was to be able to provide gas to Alaskans. And they'll gain the value, certainly for lower cost, due to the large volume of gas transported down that pipeline, which will be mostly covered through the sale of those gas assets. And at the terminus of this, in Nikiski, directly adjacent to the Kenai LNG plant that you've heard Lisa talk about, is the new 20 million ton per year LNG production facility, where we convert the gas from a gaseous state to a liquid state, and we'll be exporting that to the Asian markets. As I said, the authorizations, the federal permitting process that we started in 2017, we've run through that process. We've now received all of those major federal authorizations, and they've been granted to AGDC for the Alaska LNG project. So this means the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Section 3 authorization, the Department of Energy's authorization to export to both free trade and non-free trade countries are held by the project. All of the other project permits that you see on this sheet have been granted to us and are complete, and we're keeping them compliant to make sure that as we proceed forward, they'll be ready and available to use to be able to move this project forward. In addition to the permits, we were granted rights of way across both the state of Alaska and federal lands, including those operated by BLM, as well as the National Park Service through Denali National Park. And then we were granted a cultural resource management plan, most recently with the state of Alaska, the major facility air permits, which are necessary for the emissions coming out of both the Arctic carbon capture as well as the liquefaction facility. This work, this regulatory effort, as well as the front-end engineering and design, took nearly a decade's worth of effort. As you know, any major project, or any project in particular, takes a considerable amount of time and expense to be able to do that. We went through and did initial scoping back in the 2012, 2013 timeframes. We've been through not one, but now 2 environmental impact statements that, with the data that was provided, the volume of information that we acquired and what we submitted to the resource agencies was truly voluminous. And this represents nearly $1 billion of effort paid for by not only the state of Alaska, but partners previously with ExxonMobil, BP, and Conoco to bring this project to this state. Those permits are legally tied to the project, and they're not necessarily legally transferred to a new project or to a new project scope. Because of the purpose and need that were generated at the start of the project that went through the regulatory framework, the impacts that were specific to this project as well as the project footprint. However, in discussions with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we've seen and talked to them about the ability to phase the project, because we've got three mega projects in one: Arctic carbon capture, the pipeline, and the liquefaction facility. We wanted to talk to them about the ability to maybe pre-build the pipeline effort to utilize gas coming out of Point Thompson to be able to have delivery of gas to Alaskans. That will be an ongoing discussion, again, as we bring in our private sector parties, but also with regulators to be able to identify the opportunity through the implementation plans that FERC requires to allow us to start up providing gas to Alaskans first, and potentially with the one train of LNG production. And the phasing concept that we talked about, as I just described, is Point Thompson gas. Again, it has a lower concentration of CO2 that with a little bit of kit at the existing pad could deliver into a pipeline structure that would meet essentially pipeline quality gas specs that could be then fed into the distribution systems that exist not only in Fairbanks, but also in South Central Alaska. This is a concept that when we were going through the Infrastructure Act and the federal government and the state was looking for opportunities, we identified this as a early phased option for the Alaska LNG project, and again asked for the federal government to fund it, but they elected not to do that. So that concept is still out there. We've looked at the plans and what it would take in order to do that, as well as looking at the execution schedule to be able to accomplish that. And then the second phase of the project would truly be the full build out of all the components of the Alaska LNG project, including carbon capture, the compression stations, and the liquefaction facility in the Kissimmee. So some aspects of the Alaska LNG project and what has made it different than what we've seen in the past from iterations from our competitors is that we have the ability to displace a tremendous amount of coal-fired power generation in Asia. So the chart on the right-hand side shows, again, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions equivalency between coal-fired generation or gas-fired generation in Asia from gas supplied from the Alaska LNG project. And that difference is about a 55% reduction in emissions, and that equates to about 77 million tons a year of CO2 that would not be emitted by utilizing Alaska LNG as opposed to coal. As we've seen over the last couple of years, the increase in coal-fired power generation due to the Russian invasion and the high cost of commodities subsequent to that. So the outcome of this, from our perspective, is that we do have the ability to help in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by eliminating up to 19 coal-fired power plants, and the equivalency, it would be like constructing 16,000 wind turbines, which is a significant hurdle. Now, the demand forecast, and this is something that is still being debated, but I will tell you, just arriving back from Vancouver this morning from an LNG conference, the market demand is still out there and growing. In particular, in Asia, when we look at the countries that utilize natural gas, whether it be Japan, Korea, China, and now the Southeast Asian countries, they are looking to replace their coal-fired power with LNG. They all have their net zero targets of 2050, and so it's a delicate dance of what they want to be able to bring in. However, China alone is looking to increase or double their natural gas consumption within the next decade. So that's a considerable amount of what is shown on here in terms of the global supply demand forecast. And then what we show it in the horizontal strip there is at 20 million tons per year, what is the size that Alaska would be contributing to that new demand pool. We are in conversations with investors and buyers at this time that clearly see the value of LNG as a commodity, but also as a strategic asset. The countries of Japan, certainly in their investments in Russia, and the actions by the Russian state to those investments have been very problematic for them. We heard most recently from the U.S. ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, who came here last month to talk about the option of using Alaska LNG as a strategic asset for our U.S. allies that are in defense compacts with us, in economic compacts. The ability to utilize and support our allies from a Pacific Coast project, U.S. project, to be able to meet their energy needs is truly keen as they look to transition to their energy scenarios. And then Alaska has the ability, certainly around Cook Inlet, for not only LNG production, but also, as I heard the questions talk about, both green hydrogen, but also blue hydrogen coming out of an ammonia facility. So what we have done from where we were in 2017 is we've lowered the cost of supply. At that time, we were around $11 to $12 per million BTU delivered into Asia. But through the economic or the commercial structure changes, the optimization to the project, lower rates of return from the investors that are willing to take lower return rates and are working with us to develop this model, we now are showing, again, a cost of supply delivered to Asia at $6.55. So the cost stack on the right-hand side, again, it includes raw gas or fuel gas costs for buying the gas on the North Slope, conditioning the gas through the Arctic Carbon Capture Plant or ACC at 80 cents, a pipeline tariff to move the gas from the North Slope down to Nikiski at $1.35, and then for the Asian customers, liquefaction and shipping. But for Alaskan customers, it's that lower three stack that is truly where we see that would be the value to be able to provide gas to Alaskans at a significantly lower cost than we currently pay. Now, when we were talking to folks about our abilities to supply at this cost of supply, and then looking at our competition, whether they be oil indexed contracts or U.S. Gulf Coast indexed with Henry Hub contracts, or even the spot market, which is called JKM, Japanese Korea Marker, we see that we're competitive. And we know that these prices fluctuate. Last year, JKM was at over $70 per million BTU. Now it's down to around 14. So it truly fluctuates, and we feel that we have the ability to put in place long-term contracts. And the industry is moving back to those long-term contracts to be able to meet their needs going out in the future. And this cost stack also does account for recent inflation that we've seen both in supply chain and cost of materials, the benefits of the 45Q tax credits that I talked about, as well as the financial return expectations that we have received from potential investors. So the priority, as I said, one of our missions coming into this project was that we have a supply for Alaskans. And you may recall when the producers were delivering the project, they talked about 3 offtakes only for Alaska. From our perspective, as long as it's economically viable, there's a creditworthy downstream entity that wants the offtake, and we are going to be able to provide them offtake from this pipeline. We've built in excess capacity to the pipeline to allow for 500 million standard cubic feet a day for Alaska's needs. Current projections are about 220 million standard cubic feet a day. So with 500, that gives us a growth opportunity of 280 million standard cubic feet a day. That allows for long-term Alaska natural gas demand growth, as well as providing for additional natural resource developments, value-added opportunities for others, or even, as I talked about, in terms of blue ammonia production from Alaska to meet the needs and demands within Asia. So what I wanted to show you is, again, from that cost stack, we feel that delivery into distribution systems coming off the Alaska LNG pipeline would be a delivery price of about $4 to $5 per million BTU. Now, this is a significant reduction over current prices and would ultimately result in the saving of hundreds of dollars per year of residents that are currently on using natural gas production. But for those in the interior that would then be gaining access to pipeline gas and the pipeline gas costs, it would literally save them thousands of dollars. So that is our goal. That's our hope, to be able to put in place this infrastructure pipeline to be able to provide Alaskans' needs. And then the chart on the lower portion of it really just shows comparisons over Cook Inlet natural gas prices over the last decade or so. Now, the resource use, as we all know, Prudhoe Bay production in particular peaked in the late 80s and has been on a decline. Most recently, what Hillcorp and the producers have done is been able to help stem that decline, and we now have more of a flat curve. But at the same time, we do have this natural gas that's currently being produced on a daily basis and being re-injected. And then there's been enhanced oil recovery that's helped produce more oil, and the gas itself is provided for gas cap pressurization. But we've received, or the producers actually received in 2015, authorization specifically from the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to offtake 3.9 billion cubic feet a day off of Prudhoe Bay alone for major gas sales. So it's been looked at in terms of the resource allocation and availability and benefit to the state, and that decision was made almost 10 years ago. So what does it mean to the state of Alaska in regards to the revenue that would be generated from a major gas sales from the Alaska LNG project? And this chart was produced by the State of Alaska Department of Revenue this spring, and it really looks at existing tax structures through not only property tax, but corporate income taxes, royalty, and production taxes. So this equates to, you know, as we're going through the first few years with the debt service, $600+ million a year, and then beyond the debt financing time frame, it's 2040s, 50s, you're looking at in excess of $1 billion. So there is ample opportunity and generation of revenue for the state of Alaska from the Alaska LNG project. It will never replace oil, you know, and because the energy content difference between oil and gas, but it's the opportunity to provide for those resources to generate revenues for the state of Alaska as well as the government. So where do we find ourselves today is that AGDC as an organization is very small. We have done our work to be able to meet the obligations of getting the regulatory risk put behind us and keep everything current, look at optimization as well as the cost structure, commercial aspects. But now we know that it's time to bring back in private sector enterprise to be able to take this project forward. So we are in a capital raise right now, which is being led by Goldman Sachs and their managing director, a guy by the name of Michael Sachs, and actually are out talking to parties, not only strategic parties, but private equity firms, LNG developers, pipeline developers and operators, to be able to come into the project and take us through the front-end engineering and design to get to a final investment decision. So that effort, that third-party cost and support is what we find ourselves in today. And that was part of the reason to go to Vancouver, was to begin interface with parties that are keenly interested in this and are putting large assets. And when they say that, I mean tens of people looking at the resources that we have and what we've developed to be able to provide them a keen insight into the structure, the technical aspects, the regulatory aspects, as well as the economic aspects of this project. And they can make that decision then to commit to funding this project to move us forward. We're approaching a good set of interested parties that are now meeting together to be able to look at this and be able to actively put their money to bear to be able to move us forward. So that, again, that raise is through Goldman Sachs through a structured capital raise process. And it's truly with folks that truly have the capabilities of the financially capable, that have the expertise, they have operating entities, whether they be LNG plants, pipelines, or gas processing facilities, as well as equity off-takers. And that's important. These are the markets that want to then have gas coming off the project, but also to invest in the project moving forward. So to do that, AGDC has created a subsidiary called 8-Star Alaska. And this is where we have placed the assets of the Alaska LNG project, and where we will then be divesting our 100% ownership stake down and retaining a 25% ownership stake for the state of Alaska. Because the state of Alaska, as I indicated earlier, has spent a considerable amount of money advancing this project, keeping this project current and going. And so we want to make sure that we have the ability for the state of Alaska to have then some of the benefits of that sunk cost. Buying in at 75% equity stake will allow them to then become essentially, we put in leadership roles to be able to advance the project. We are making sure that we have in place, though, a timeline, because we don't want others to come in, take on leadership, and then slow the project down because they have other competing interests. So it will be with a specific schedule that they'll agree to at the outset, or they lose their opportunity. So it'll be moving through the 8-Star process, and again, this will be at a project holding company level to get us to final investment decision, where we will then look to the large capital raise of approximately $43 billion. The highlights of this project, again, are, I've said them before, proximity to Asia lowers the cost of gas. The greenhouse gas standard for the Alaska LNG project compared to others, we're one of the lowest carbon emissions LNG opportunities out there for investors. It's economic. We have proven gas reserves that are produced on a daily basis, so there's no development risk associated with going out and find the gas. There's no commodity linkage between what we have in the lower 48 with Henry Hub. We can look at either fixed price contract, Henry Hub price contract, oil index contract. We have the flexibility to be able to meet the needs of the off-takers and what they want, and be able to provide them with, again, long-term steady supply from just the two resources in Prudhoe Bay and Point Thompson. And then in the future, it will come from the ancillary fields that are surrounding Point Thompson, and this gas is found in other oil explorations farther to the west. So what have we done to try and help out for Alaska's utilities as we go forward? As AGDC is currently the 100% owner of 8-Star Alaska, we wanted to offer up to the utilities a supply agreement that would ensure that they receive the gas supply on preferential terms. So it would give them, again, the priority basis so they could supply and meet their needs of their residential, commercial, and industrial companies. It would be that at a price would be no higher than that would be paid by the LNG facility, so that they would be locked in terms of a lower cost. And that in the event of any disruption, that the utilities would be prioritized over LNG exports, and it allowed them to utilize the demand growth is there, and once there's desire for more growth, we have that within the 500 million that we've kept. So that's been offered to the utilities as an opportunity right now, while we are 100% owner. And again, this will likely go away when others come in, and they're going to want to maximize their return on their investments and look at the higher cost of gas, even for Alaskans. Another ancillary benefit of the Alaska LNG project was written into our enabling statutes, Alaska Statute 3705610, and it was called the Alaska Affordable Energy Fund. And it was really recognition that Alaskans that aren't directly along the pipeline route will still have energy issues and options, and there will be a need for affordable energy in those communities. And this creates a separate fund that the legislature could then be able to grant monies out to those communities to be able to help in reducing, making affordable energy in those communities. So it's set to receive an annual deposit of 20% of the state royalty after payment into the formula. So envision this as about a $25 to $50 million a year endowment that's created by this project, but it will help those smaller communities to look to meet their needs going into the future. So one of the commercial aspects that we are focusing our time on right now and are bringing in these investors is on the gas sales agreement with the North Slope producers. Those that have the rights within both Prudhoe Bay and Point Thompson, namely ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and Hilcorp, have the gas, and we need to be able to have put in place gas sales pricing agreements to be able to work with the downstream off-takers that want to make sure that their surety of supply. So we're working those. That's a top priority for ourselves, but also it's been conveyed through the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Revenue, the importance of this to the project and to Alaskans. Goldman Sachs has also been involved in this to relay the message of what they are hearing from the downstream off-takers and the investors to bring to the producers that the importance of those gas sales agreements. We are in discussions on terms and conditions right now. Those are actually exchanging red line copies between them. Those will establish the price, term, and volume to buy the gas and sell the gas. So these will be fully termed supply agreements, 20 years, that will be ultimately consummated with our private sector and parties that come into the project. And to date, again, we're getting various levels of engagement from the producers. But again, it's a priority for us and for the state of Alaska that these gas sales agreements get agreed to very quickly. And then on the downstream side, on the LNG sales agreements, we have been truly continued the discussions and the negotiations with multiple LNG off-takers and buyers. We have fairly advanced negotiations, so with ongoing price discussions. And I'm talking about Asian utility buyers, but also LNG traders, as well as large portfolio players from the international oil companies that truly are the world leaders in terms of supplying LNG to the world. And they're coming to us now to say, we're keenly interested in offtake from Alaska. It fits within their portfolio prospects. And as they look at arbitrage between their various supplies, they can see the value of a North Pacific LNG provider. All these buyers are creditworthy, which will be the foundation for our debt financing as we go forward. So those will again be 20-year long-term contracts. And as I said, there's the opportunity or combination of pricing from Brent-linked, which is oil-linked prices, Henry Hub, which is natural gas in the lower 48, Japanese Korean marker, or fixed prices. So that full suite of opportunity is out there, and it's in discussions with them. Right now, we are in discussions for an excess capacity of the nameplate production of the LNG facility of 20 MTPA. So because we know some will fall off, some will agree to go elsewhere. But what we're seeing is a rush now by LNG buyers as they see that the LNG demand is still growing, and long-term contracts that will be terminating at the end of this decade, but also with the impacts by Russia and specifically to some of the Japanese buyers as those contracts end, and they're going to be looking for new sources of supply. So in summary, we believe that, again, Alaska LNG has very positive benefits, not only for the state of Alaska to be able to supply lower cost, cleaner burning gas for Alaskans, but also provides state revenue. It provides infrastructure that will allow then stranded gas assets on the North Slope to be able to come to market. And we know that with the resources that are available on the North Slope, that it's truly decades, if not century, of available gas that can be brought to the market. This also allows for the transition by using those methane molecules to bridge to ammonia and hydrogen production. So we can look to the energy transition to meet it initially with LNG, but then look to the future with ammonia and hydrogen. And what we didn't talk, but maybe DNR did, about the opportunity for carbon sequestration in Cook Inlet. It's truly a world-class carbon sequestration sink. So it has been being the best on the west coast of North America, where we have 50 gigatons of carbon sequestration. So the opportunity to sequester through production of ammonia, hydrogen, carbon from that production scheme into that reservoir, or allow for any carbon capture from the consumption of LNG to come back to Alaska. So we believe that we've minimized the risks on the project, and we're looking at the existing infrastructure see that we look to lower greenhouse gas emissions from an LNG project. We're one of the lowest, as I said, carbon intensive LNG products that will be going into the market. And we're utilizing existing corridors, such as the parallel to the Dalton Highway and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, to the Parks Highway and the Alaska Railroad, so that it's in areas where there is currently infrastructure. We will be regulated under strict US as well as Alaska legal requirements. So we'll be developing a project that will be highly competitive, but also meet the high standards that Alaskans have for infrastructure in our state, with the outcome being lower cost energy for the consumers. And that brings us back to the topic of the day, and that's energy security for Alaska. The previous speaker, Lisa, talked about the options that utilities are looking at. Our goal is that we'll be able to move our project forward. And I know the timeline may not meet the initial demand needs at the outset, at the end of the decade, but we feel that we'll be able to meet the needs going off into the decades into the future with the Alaska LNG. And just to keep in touch with us to learn more, if you have any inclination, this is the contact information.
Thank you very much, Frank. With that, I'll open up the floor for questions. And just a reminder, just since this is an information session intended for the Alaska Energy Security Task Force, I'll be prioritizing the questions coming in from the panelists. Well, it looks like you gave a perfect presentation since there are no questions at this time. Or maybe
Good, Jeremy, thank you.
Give it a few more minutes, or a little bit more. And also, the panelists themselves are welcome to ask questions too. With that, I guess I'll take the opportunity to ask a question. Following up on your comments there, Frank, at the end about carbon sequestration and potential for ammonia and other kind of hydrogen-related end products. And you can tell me, no, you're not allowed to answer this, but is there an interest from the Asian markets in those alternate fuels?
Absolutely. So what I didn't talk about is we have an MOU currently with Mitsubishi and Toyo Engineering and others on the development of blue ammonia production from Norfolk natural gas coming off the pipeline. So they're keenly interested in looking at the opportunity from an Alaska production, again, due to the close proximity, the short shipping distances, and lower greenhouse gas emissions from that shipping. So that's an ongoing discussion with them. In addition, the current mothball nutrient facility, that company would certainly like to be able to restart that plant and look to utilizing the new technologies called autothermal reforming to be able to produce blue ammonia at their location, which is really been sitting idle since late 2007 because of lack of supply of low cost gas.
Thanks, and we do have one thank you in the comments here from Representative McKay. One final question here. Backhaul of CO2 from those Asian markets, has that been discussed? Or is that kind of beyond your scope?
No, it's again, we've talked to major shipping lines both in Korea and in Japan that are looking at the carriers, looking at the technology, looking at the structure of the ship that would potentially be a one direction an ammonia carrier and the return haul a CO2 carrier. So MOL lines, others are truly looking at the opportunity out there. They see that the country goal of Japan is to be able to get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions. So they want to make sure they can capture the carbon dioxide from their emissions. They're looking for ways to be able to sequester that carbon. And that's been part of the conversation coming back to Alaska. To provide you with an energy source such as LNG or even ammonia, you capture the carbon coming off the consumption of that. We also would have the opportunity to be able to sequester that carbon in the state of Alaska.
Great, thank you very much. We had one more thank you there in the comments. With that, that concludes our agenda for today. Thank you for joining us. Special thank you to our presenters. As a reminder, we will post the slideshows on the AEA website for the Energy Security Task Force as soon as we are able. Next week, we have another presentation, same time, let's see, well, maybe a different time, but Thursday, July 20th at 11 a.m. The topic for next week is Alaska Rural Energy, Challenges and Opportunities for Reducing Costs. And we have 3 great speakers. I believe they're all confirmed at this point, but if not, then I'm going to put them on the spot and hopefully get them to confirm. We have Bill Stamm, the CEO and president of Alaska Village Electric Cooperative. Bill will present on AVEC's work on kind of the challenges and realities of power generation and delivery in rural Alaska, including AVEC's approach to renewable energy development and the interconnection of communities, as well as strategies to reduce cost and streamline management of rural power systems. We also have Dennis Miners, who's the president and founder of Intelligent Energy Systems. Dennis will provide an overview of his integrated approaches to heat and power that IES has pioneered. Ingemar Mathiasen, who is the energy manager with the Northwest Arctic Borough, will present on several innovative case studies from his region, including the use of air source heat pumps and high contribution renewable energy systems. So looking forward to next week's presentation. And with that, we will wrap it up. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.